So I'm Professor Bob Scholes. I'm a Professor of Systems Ecology. That's the ecology of big scales. And I work in the Global Change and Sustainability Research Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand. And mostly I work on issues of global change. Not only climate change, but biodiversity loss and many of the other social changes going on in the world at the moment. Climate change is a rising in the temperature of the world with a lot of knock-on effects in terms of circulation and rainfall, which is caused by an imbalance in the radiation coming into the Earth relative to what's going out from the Earth. And the reason for that imbalance is an increase in the concentration of certain gases in the atmosphere that trap the outgoing radiation. It's clearly caused by humans. There is a small contribution of natural effects in the variability of the climate, but the overall rising trend is caused by humans. Modern human societies that we've become dependent on evolved under actually a remarkably consistent climate in global terms. And if we go outside of that bound, it's not clear that we will be able to sustain the levels of sophistication and adequacy of food supply and water supply that we're currently used to. Well, there's really only two views. There's the evidence-based scientific view, and then there's the other one. All the fundamental physics and all the measurements that have been taken at thousands of locations around the world are unequivocal that the climate is changing, and the reasons for it are the human interference in the global climate system. There are many other views which I am not going to try and defend. They are mostly views of people who, for one or other reason, are unwilling to accept that we have in fact had that effect on the climate. Some of those people might have a vested interest. They might be in industries which are causing the problem. They might feel deeply threatened by the fact that their actions have contributed to this problem. So the Earth goes through many natural cycles. The obvious ones are the day-night cycle and the 365-day annual cycle. We also have cycles at many other intervals, including 20,000 years, 35,000 years, 100,000 years. We put all of those cycles into our understanding of the global climate system, and the trend that we see currently is not explained by any of those known cycles. For small degrees of climate change, we're relatively resilient. And the reason that is that South Africa has quite a variable climate, and so we have learned to cope with the fact that some years we get rainfall, other years we don't get rainfall, sometimes it's really hot, sometimes it's not so hot. But if we go beyond a certain level, then our ability to cope with climate change falls to pieces completely. So we have a sort of a natural adaptation capability which is being stretched at the moment, and it affects things like our agricultural sector. And that's only a few % of the economy. However, if we have large amounts of climate change, then it affects things like water supply, and that affects across the entire economy. And if it gets extreme, then everything is at risk. So there's a couple of different types of ways you could think about such a limit. One of those limits is simply a limit which society agrees that going above that would be a dangerous thing to do. An example of that is the speed limit. We agree as society that we may not drive faster than 120 kilometers an hour. That doesn't mean it's impossible to drive at 125 kilometers an hour, or that you're perfectly safe at 110 kilometers an hour. But we agree that somewhere out there's a limit that we shouldn't exceed. And the world has agreed to a climate limit of that sort at 2 degrees Celsius warming globally above the pre-industrial level. Now, the world is not going to come to a grinding halt if we go to 2.1, and I'm not saying it's perfectly safe at 1.9 either, but the risks increase very steeply after that. There is a second set of limits which are determined by physics and biology, and those are not negotiable. For instance, the melting point of ice is at 0 degrees Celsius, and no amount of sitting around a negotiating table changes that. If the temperature in Greenland and Antarctica rises above 0 degrees, those ice caps melt whether we like it or not. There are other examples. For instance, the body temperature of mammals, such as ourselves or such as our livestock, is absolutely fixed at about 37.5 degrees. And as the global temperature rises towards that, it becomes increasingly difficult for mammals like us to survive. And then there's a third type of threshold, which is called the tipping point. And that's, if we cross those, then we get a sort of a runaway effect where we can't come back again. We know that such tipping points exist. It's very, very difficult to know where they occur in terms of a temperature range ahead of the time. Typically, we can tell once we've crossed them, and so we typically try to stay away from those. We have to take action both on the mitigation side, which is actually to reduce the amount of climate change, and on the adaptation side, which is to allow us to survive the climate change that we already are and will continue to be exposed to. On the adaptation side, I think that the three key things are, firstly, to become a learning society, because humans are fabulously adaptable. They adapt not like other organisms only through genetic methods, but also by learning and passing that knowledge on. So research and training and teaching and learning and sharing that knowledge is a key part of adaptation. The second thing is to build ourselves a bit of a buffer. So if we're always sailing right at the edge, for instance around water supply, then the tiniest thing pushes us over that edge. And so we have to come back from those edges, build ourselves a little bit of space there. The third thing is to look for alternative ways of doing things. So if you're unable for climate change reasons to do things this way, is there another way that you can do it? Can you plant a different crop in place of this crop? Can you generate your energy in a different way, etc.? On the mitigation side, I would say the two most important things, the most important thing, is to work together with the other nations of the world to keep our global warming target somewhere in the region of 2 degrees Celsius, which we know we can survive. But when it gets higher than that, we're getting into very difficult territory. And then in order to make that stick, we as a country have to get our own house in order. And what that really means is reducing the carbon intensity of our economy. So I'm not saying we have to stop economic growth. I'm not saying we have to stop using electricity or any of those things. We have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with our economy and our energy use. We have to decarbonize.